We're in a brand new year, but we're continuing one single story. We've got 3 months left. Whether y'all know this or not, I don't think this was intentional. It's just the way the Lord worked it out, okay? We finish on Easter Sunday, which is March the 31st, by the way. We'll finish in the book of Revelation. And so I just encourage you to hang with us. We are to 1 Timothy, all right? So 1 Timothy is the book that we're going to be looking at today. And Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are considered pastoral epistles. So he wrote them as a pastor to a pastor about generally oversight of the church and how the church should operate. He draws some clear connections between things like doctrine and ethics, belief and behavior. And you can't separate the two. That is a mistake that we make, that we think we can have this doctrine that doesn't affect our behavior, but it does. Whatever you believe should affect your behavior, and if it's not affecting your behavior, you don't believe it. Right? I hear people say things to me sometimes. They say, well, I believe this, but it doesn't transform them. If it's not transforming you, I'm not sure you believe it. You might acknowledge that it's true, but I'm not sure whether you believe it, because belief changes behavior. And so that's kind of, he kind of melds the two. He says, if you believe this, it's going to have some impact on your behavior. And so the theme of 1 Timothy is godliness, and today specifically we're going to look at godly leadership. Every year we bring on new leaders in some different form. It may be new elders or new deacons, and this year we have 4 new deacons that are coming on, and at the end of the service we're going to be praying for them, and you'll be able to be a part of that. And so I'm excited about that. But today I want us to look at our text in 1 Timothy, and it says the first thing I want to talk about is this: leadership positions are something that you can desire. I hear some overly spiritual people sometimes say things like, well, if you really want to be a leader, you shouldn't aspire to be one. Well, that's not what he says, right? He doesn't say that. As a matter of fact, if you don't want to be a leader, I don't want you to be a leader. That scared some of you. Let me say it again. If you don't want to be a leader, I don't want you to be a leader. Why? Because it requires a lot. It's not just a simple task. It's not just a title or a position. There are expectations. As a matter of fact, I tell people this all of the time. The most rights you will ever have are before you become a leader, because when you become a leader, you start giving up some rights. You no longer have the right to say whatever's on your mind. Right? Come on. Like, you no longer have the right to do whatever you want to do. You give up some rights to go up the food chain. And we have to understand that leadership causes us to have less rights, not more rights. You don't have more rights by going up. And so it's not just so you can have more rights. If you don't want to serve, then that's not the place for you. And he says this. He says, this is a trustworthy saying. If someone aspires to be a church leader, he an honorable position. The New Living Translation, which I'm using, uses the word church leader. I doubt you grew up with this terminology. Most likely you grew up with some other terminology. So it's most commonly and probably most correctly translated overseer. And so in many translations, it's going to say overseer. If you desire to be an overseer, meaning you oversee people or something, then you desire something that is honorable. It can also be, or sometimes is translated to words like bishop. For example, the denomination that I grew up in, when I left the denomination, I had reached the highest level of ordination, which is called an ordained bishop. As a matter of fact, so Ryan Miller and I came from the same background, and if you ever see him greet me, that's how he greets me. What's up, Bishop? That's what he says. It's kind of sarcastic, by the way, but we're just you may hear him call me Bishop. That's one of the words. The word is episkopos, which we would also get the word presbyter from, that you may hear used. And some denominations use that word presbyter here. But he says if someone aspires to be a church leader, if they aspire to be a bishop or an overseer, if they aspire to be some type of church leader, then they have desired something honorable. But I want to notice, I want to talk about this word aspire, or desire, if you will. The word literally means to stretch yourself. He says, if you are wanting to stretch yourself and become a leader, a church leader, that is a good thing. Now, the reason why I appreciate that is this. If you aspire or stretch yourself for the wrong reasons, you may find yourself ripped instead of stretched. I have seen people from time to time find themselves in church leadership positions and they were not prepared. Either their motives were wrong, their heart was wrong, they weren't mature enough to handle it, and then they faced some type of difficult situation. Because if you're in church leadership, you're going to face some difficult situations. And it crushed them, it ripped them, it tore them. They weren't prepared. Maybe you've seen this on your job or in your business or in your career where someone, they got a promotion that they weren't prepared for. They thought they wanted it. They thought they needed it. They thought that was for them. And then when they got it, the pressure of it just crushed them. It ripped them. It tore them. And he says, if you aspire or if you're willing or desire or want to stretch yourself to be a church leader or an overseer or bishop, he says, you're desiring something that is honorable, but make sure that your motives are right. If you aspire to be a church leader for the wrong reasons, you may find yourself ripped instead of stretched. And the further you go up the food chain, the more stretched you're going to become. And listen, we could take this out of church leadership and just apply it to your job. The further you go up the food chain in any organization, the more stretched you're going to become. The more you realize that this is more difficult than you thought. Like some people, how many of you, somebody has said, I wish I had your job. And in your mind you thought, I wish you had my job too, right? That's always been my response about, I wish I owned my own business. My response always in my mind was, well, I got a couple I'll sell you, right? Because it ain't everything you think it's cracked up to be. The more you go up the food chain, the more stretched you become. There are more responsibilities and less rights. That's the thing you need to understand. The further you go up any organizational ladder, the more responsibility you gain and the less rights that you have. And we like rights, right? We have a Bill of Rights in America, and we think, well, it's my right to do whatever. When you become a leader, you lose a lot of rights and you gain a lot of responsibility. And he says, if you're willing to stretch yourself, that is an honorable thing. Here's the second thing. There are higher expectations. Now, in this passage that we're going to cover today, he talks about elders or church leaders or bishops, because that's another way, elders is another way that it's translated, or overseers. It doesn't really matter. And he talks about deacons. And we'll talk about deacons in just a minute because there is some differences in his expectations of elders, bishops, overseers, and deacons. But there's a couple of things I want to point out. First of all, I'll talk about the distinctions later. The main thing I want to talk about right now is there are higher expectations of those who are in church leadership. Listen, this has nothing to do with going to heaven, right? Because people say, well, I'm saved. That ain't got nothing to do with it. I'll meet you on the other side. Let me say, this is how I see it frequently. Everybody is welcome in this room. But everybody can't get a microphone. Right? Some people don't need a microphone. Come on. Some people don't deserve. There are some people, that's why we don't do open mics. Right? I grew up in testimony time. I am scared to death. I've done it a couple of times. I'm scared to death to give somebody a microphone not knowing what they weren't going to say. Because I've heard some stuff now. Everybody don't deserve a microphone. Everybody doesn't deserve to be in church leadership. Why? Because there are some higher expectations. And we have to understand that for people to be in leadership positions, there must be some expectations of them. And we cannot water it down or lessen them. There have to be some requirements. This isn't a requirement to go to heaven. Listen, if we start applying these to people and say, well, you're not saved if you don't, that's a bad idea. But if I believe it's certainly acceptable and biblical for us to say, you can't be a deacon or an elder or a pastor, or you can't serve in leadership positions if you do X. Okay? So let's look at what some of them are. He says, so as a church leader, so a church leader must be a man whose life is above reproach. He must be faithful to his wife. He must exercise self-control, live wisely, and have a good reputation. He must enjoy having guests in his home, and he must be able to teach. He must not be a heavy drinker or violent. He must be gentle, not quarrelsome, and not love money. He must manage his own family well, having children who respect and obey him. For if a man cannot manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? A church leader must not be a new believer, because he might become proud, and the devil would cause him to fall. Also, people outside the church must speak well of him, so that he will not be disgraced and fall into the devil's trap. Let's talk about some of these. Some of them are clear, some of them are a little bit more ambiguous. But he begins by this one comment by saying, above reproach. Like, I think that's the overarching theme. The word above reproach could be, he has a deservedly good reputation. He is blameless. There are so many ways to describe this. He's not, in a criminal sense, he's not able to be held. Meaning there's not evidence against him to be able to hold him. No flagrant sin. And this is something, this above reproach, it sometimes is something that we can only tell over time, right? Sometimes we have to watch things play out to see if somebody actually did what they said they did or are what they say they are. Because sometimes you can't tell immediately about a situation whether they have done the right thing or acted in the right manner. Sometimes it's a challenge. It's got to be above reproach. It says he must be faithful to his wife. Most translations say it like this: he must be the husband of one wife. There's a couple of things I want to say here. He's not talking about divorce and remarriage. That's not addressed here. That's not even the situation. As a matter of fact, it would be more likely he's saying you can't have more than one wife, not you can't be, he's against polygamy more than he is against divorce and remarriage. But frankly, the wording here doesn't lend itself to either one of those. What he is saying is, this is pretty clear, you need to be faithful to your wife. Why? Because that is one of the traps of leadership. Right? Deion Sanders wrote a book called PMS. It's a man thing. Power, money, and sex, the three things that'll take a man down. Those are the three places, and he addresses two of them, really all three of them in this passage. He says you got to be faithful to your wife and your home. Listen, because we're going to see this in multiple ways in this passage. Your home is an example of how you're going to lead in the church, okay? It says he must exercise self-control, right? All of us want what? People to lead us that have self-control. He says they got to live wisely. We want wise leaders. He says they have to have a good reputation, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute, but that goes back to above reproach. It says he must enjoy having guests in his home, and he must be able to teach. Okay, there's two pieces to this. One, you got to like people to lead people, right? It's hard to lead people if you don't like people. Okay? You gotta be inviting to people. And specifically here, I think it's referring to strangers. Church leaders, I'm just going to tell you what kills most churches. Most churches die because they don't like strangers. Right? They don't like people coming in that they don't know, that look weird, that don't smell like them, talk like them, go to the same school as them, live on the same street as them. A church that is growing has to be welcoming to people to walk in their door. And then he says he must be able to teach. Most church leaders should have the ability to share, to teach with other people. That's one of the expectations of elders, pastors, teachers, whatever, bishops, overseers that you see here. He must not be a heavy drinker or violent, okay? Drunkenness, we're not going to talk about teetotal here. I grew up in a teetotal atmosphere and church where, absolutely couldn't drink. Nothing. Like you couldn't even look at it. That's not what it says here. Here's what I'm going to tell you about Scripture. Scripture does not forbid alcohol, but it always, 100% of the time, forbids drunkenness. And if you don't know whether you've been drunk or not, you have. Right? That's the answer. And Andy Stanley has a great line about this. He says the King James word is debauched, and he says nobody knows what sip makes them debauched. We all know what sober looks like, and we all know what drunk looks like. We just don't know when we took that one sip that took us from sober to drunk. And so he says you can't be a heavy drinker, you can't be violent. On the opposite side of that, you must be gentle, not quarrelsome, and you can't love money. Trap number 2, by the way, in the list of 3 things that'll bring you down the quickest is money. You can't love money because if you do, you could go through the history of pastoral resignations and trouble, and almost every one of them are going to fall in money, sex, or power. I mean, maybe a couple of times they got theologically off base, but most of the time it's money, sex, and power. And he says he must manage his own family well, having children who respect and obey him. This goes back to that family unit. How your family unit operates will determine or give some insight into how you are going to lead the church. He says, for if a man cannot manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? And he goes on to say, a church leader must not be a new believer because he might become proud and the devil would cause him to fall. He's like, if you promote somebody too fast, they get haughty, right? They say, look at me. This is about me. I'm good. And it's not about you. As a matter of fact, becoming a church leader is one of the most humbling things you could ever do. I would love to invite you in some of the rooms that I have to sit in with church leaders and talk about some of the things we have to talk about. You would realize this isn't the joyous job that I thought it was, right? But then he says about church leaders. So we apply this to pastors, elders, overseers, bishops, whatever the word is you want to put here. Also, people outside the church must speak well of him so that he will not be disgraced and fall into the devil's trap. Elders or overseers or church leaders can't just have a reputation that is good inside the church. People outside the church also have to speak well of them. Now, let me point to this last thing. There are some distinctions. So he makes some differences between elders or overseers or church leaders and deacons, okay? He tells us that there is some distinctions between the two. Here at Open Door, we have pastors, and some of our pastors serve as elders, and then we have elders, and then we have deacons. We're a staff-led church, so most of the ministry aspects of the church are led by our staff. The directional piece. Then we have elders who I describe as guardrails. They're there to keep everybody between the ditches, right? They're there for theological guardrails, financial guardrails, moral guardrails. Make sure people aren't going in the ditch. That's the biggest thing that elders are there for. And then our deacons are an extension of pastoral care. They're there to serve the congregation. And he says this, in the same way, deacons must be well respected and have integrity. They must not be heavy drinkers or dishonest with money. They must be committed to the mystery of the faith now revealed and must live with a clear conscience. Before they are appointed as deacons, let them be closely examined. If they pass the test, then let them serve as deacons. In the same way, their wives must be respected and not slander others. They must exercise self-control and be faithful in everything they do. A deacon must be faithful to his wife, and he must manage his children and household well. Those who do well as deacons will be rewarded with respect from others and will have increased confidence in their faith in Christ Jesus. He lists some of the very same things. They must have respect and integrity. By the way, integrity is not perfection. Integrity is about wholeness. We can't expect perfection from anybody. Let's do it like this. If you're perfect, stand. That's good. At least you're honest. None of us are perfect, okay? But we can still have integrity. Integrity means, okay, when we have the opportunity to make it right, we do, and we don't do it that same way the second time. Okay? He says they have to have integrity. They have to have respect. They must be committed to their faith. It tells us to examine them closely, to watch, to look. So this is an inside thing. Deacons, in my opinion, don't have to have the respect of people outside yet, but they do have to respect of the people on the inside. They have to look. People have to examine their life to see how they're living and what they are doing. And so we believe our deacons should have respect. Examine them closely. And he talks about wives here, and he says they're to serve together. They both meet those same qualifications. And if they do the right thing and they live the right way, they will be rewarded with respect from others and will have increased confidence in their faith. There are rewards for leading with integrity. When you lead with integrity, people will give you more responsibility and they will trust you more and give you more.